Is there a fifth mode or a lost mode of prayer that allows us to move beyond needing intervention, beyond asking for help, a mode of prayer that allows us to be part of the solution? So in other words, is there a way of communicating with the divine matrix, with this Higgs field, that considers us as part of, rather than separate from, the field that we are experiencing from within? Well, the answer is the reason that I'm sharing this episode. It's a resounding yes. So what I'd like to do is share an example. This is a story, it's a true story that happened to me when I left the corporations in the early 1990s, and I moved to a piece of land in the high desert of northern New Mexico. And those of you that live in that part of the world, you may remember the 1990s was one of the worst droughts in recorded history. The elders of the native peoples, they said in the memory of their ancestors, they'd never seen a drought that had lasted as long as what we were experiencing. It was going on 5+ years. It was terrible. Cattle were dying, crops were dying, people were selling their farms because they could no longer support themselves on the land. And it was during this time that a native friend of mine called me one morning. And to honor his privacy, I'm going to call him David, even though David is not really his name. But David called me one morning and he asked me, he said, "Greg, would you like to meet me and accompany me to a place that is so old, no one even knows who built this place. It was built by the hands of our ancestors. It is a wheel. It is a circle of stone where we offer our prayers, because in this place, the skin between the worlds is very thin." I love that terminology. So he said, "Would you like to join me to offer a prayer of rain?" And I didn't have to think twice. I said, "You bet." And I met David and we hiked into this place. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. As an Anglo, as a Westerner, I expected to see some chanting, some kind of ceremony, maybe some dancing. And what I saw was David. He sat on the ground. He took off his old work boots. He unlaced them and put them outside the circle. He stepped into the circle with his naked feet on the ground. He closed his eyes. He honored all of his ancestors. He honored the directions, all 6 of them. And then he closed his eyes with his hands in a prayer mudra over his heart, just for a few seconds. This is outside of the town of Taos, New Mexico. It's the nearest city of any size. And he looked at me. He opened his eyes and he looked and he said, "I'm hungry. You want to get a bite to eat?" And he was inside the circle. And I said, "Well, yes." I said, "But I thought you were going to pray for rain." And he looked at me, and what he said has stayed with me so powerfully for so long, and it's helped so many people when they think about how this prayer works. He looked at me and said, "No." He said, "If I prayed for rain, rain could never happen." He said, "Because the moment I pray for rain, I have just told the universe that rain does not exist here. The moment I pray for it to happen, I'm acknowledging that it's not here now." And I said, "Well, if you didn't pray for rain just now," I said, "when you close your eyes, what did you just do?" And he said, "When I closed my eyes," he said, "I felt the feeling of what it feels like when it rains in my Pueblo village." He said, "I felt the feeling of what it feels like to stand with my naked feet in the mud, and the mud is there because there's been so much rain." He said, "I smelled the smells of what the rain smells like when it rolls off the earthen walls from our Pueblo, and I felt what it would feel like to walk through the corn that's this high against my naked chest, and it's this high because there's been so much rain to grow the corn, and then I give thanks of gratitude and appreciation for the rain that has already happened." All right, can you see now, through everything that we have explored, everything we've discovered in this series, can you see what David has just done? He's brought together so many of the concepts. He's acknowledging that there's a field out there, number one, that he's communicating with that field. He's acknowledging that the feeling is the language that the field recognizes. It's not so much about the words. The words can be spoken. However, if the words are spoken, the goal is to create the feeling, all right? And he's acknowledging that he has the potential as a man, a human, in the presence of this field, to reach inside of the field into the realm of all things that are possible and isolate the possibility of his choice and collapse that potential into something real in our world. And he's doing it through a very sophisticated internal technology that we call the lost mode of prayer. It is a feeling-based prayer. The key, feeling as if the prayer is already answered. coming from the outcome. There is a huge difference between working toward the outcome a little at a time and beginning with the outcome. And you've probably seen this huge difference in your life as a child. I know that I did. For example, I was told when I was young, if I scrape my knee on the sidewalk, that the healing is going to happen slowly, gradually, over a period of time. And you know what? Sure enough, that's exactly the way it happened. I would look and expect, my mom told me, she said, every day it's going to get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. And I'd look, and she was right. It was getting a little better, a little better, and a little better. Is it possible that when we look at our bodies with that kind of expectation, that the healing actually reflects, it mirrors our expectation? And if that is true, what would happen if we begin with the outcome? I want to tell you, I've done this in my life, and it has worked. And that's why I can sit here and look at you right now, and I can tell you, I know that this modality of prayer works. And when we talk about prayer, we're talking about this as a code interacting with creation. This has nothing to do with any religion whatsoever, and I want to be really clear about that. Although religions have wrapped the rules and the dogma around these deeply spiritual principles in the past, and actually led to people in some respects feeling further from their power. It has disempowered the people, the rules and the dogma. So we're cutting right through the rules and the dogma. We're going to the essence of our most ancient and cherished spiritual technology. It's about the relationship between you and me, the field, the earth, the heavens, the cosmos, and our bodies. So I've had the opportunity to begin my healing from the place where we are conditioned to think that it leads, to feel the feeling as if the healing has already happened. In other programs, I've talked about this. I went through a physical in the year 2000. There was a tumor inside my bladder that doctors wanted to operate on physically. I acknowledged that. I applied everything that I had learned in my life, and I really applied it. I didn't just kind of apply it. I lived the deepest truths, the existence of everything that I'm saying to you in this program, and it takes work. It takes work to do that. And I did that work, and when I went back, fully prepared for surgery if it was needed, what the doctors found was there's no need for the surgery. But I've done this with cuts and scrapes as well. Our bodies will respond. We're part of the field. We're emerging from this field, and we communicate with the field in a language that recognizes emotion, feeling, just like David did with the rain. Then the field responds. So let me tell you what happened with the rain. David and I went into Taos, New Mexico. We had lunch about an hour south of where this prayer was offered. By the time I got back onto my land, something began to happen that we hadn't seen in a long time. Big black clouds came in over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. It started to rain, and it rained. And it rained and rained and rained. It rained all that night. It rained the next morning. It rained the next afternoon. It rained and rained. It rained so much the ground was so dry it couldn't absorb the rain, and everything began to flood. Fields were flooded. Cattle were stranded. Roads were washed out. And I called my friend on the phone. I'm just going to share this with you. I called my friend on the phone and I said, David, man, this is a mess. I said, what is happening? And he was quiet just for a moment. And he said, Greg, that's the part of the prayer our ancestors could never figure out. He said they could tell it to rain, but they couldn't tell it how much to rain. So I cannot prove to you scientifically that David's prayer had anything to do with the rain that came in that afternoon. I cannot prove that to you as a scientist. As a scientist, what I have to say is there's a high correlation between the rain that appeared that hadn't been seen in a long time and what David had just done hours earlier. And the weatherman would agree. I watched the weatherman that evening, and on the weather maps, what they showed was a low pressure front that came across Utah, Wyoming, and it came into Colorado and then down into northern New Mexico, and it made a little loop and went right back up. And that low pressure system is what brought the rain to that place. So when we talk about these things, some of these are anecdotal stories, but they're illustrating from an indigenous perspective a very powerful concept. Look at what David did. He incorporated all of his senses. He didn't ask for something to happen. He felt it had already happened. He smelled what it smells like when it happens. He heard the sounds of the rain. I didn't even tell you about that part, but he heard the sounds of the rain. And he felt as if that rain is already there. I'm going to invite you to think about this as we go into this modality of prayer that I'm going to share with you. So the principles that I'm sharing in this mode are very simple. They're also very ancient. And everything I'm saying to you, we see the instructions for this kind of prayer, for this code that allows us to speak directly to the matrix, we see these principles recorded in some of our most ancient, cherished spiritual traditions. And I'm talking about lost biblical books that I described earlier in this program. These are the books that were discovered in the mid-20th century as the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt. Remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest records of the Old Testament. The Nag Hammadi Library are the oldest records of the New Testament, both of them found in the mid-20th century, the 1940s. And in that Nag Hammadi Library, the 43-plus books that were completely removed from the biblical canon in the 4th century by the Emperor Constantine were intact in the Nag Hammadi Library, including the Gospel of Thomas that we've spoken about earlier. Thomas the scribe, that followed the Master, Jesus, the teacher, not a religious man from this perspective, but he followed the teacher, and he recorded the words, the exact words of the teacher. And this is important because there is a place in the Gospel of Thomas where his students asked the teacher how to communicate with the field. They didn't use those terms. They asked how to communicate with God. And it's in the Gospel of Thomas that we find the instructions for the 5th mode, the lost mode of prayer. Now, I mentioned earlier that you've heard the term when something is lost in translation. And it is this translation that I'm going to share with you from this biblical book after its discovery. It is a beautiful example of just how much a difference, one difference, an error in translation can make. So it's in the Gospel of Thomas that we actually find the instructions for this 5th or this lost mode of prayers, as I mentioned. So let me first read to you the translation in the authorized version of the King James Bible as we see it today. If you'd like to see this for yourself, it's in King James Version, the book of John 16 through 23 is where you would find this. I know you've heard this before. How many of you have heard, ask and ye shall receive? That's where this comes from. But let me read you the translation. The translation goes like this: Whatsoever ye ask the Father in my name, he will give it to you. Ask and ye shall receive, that your joy may be full. Okay, and that's the end of the translation. I don't know about you. When I was a kid, I would ask and ask and ask, and not much would happen. And I became very frustrated. Many people do. And we feel powerless. We feel that our prayers really aren't making any difference because we're not seeing any way to reinforce that our prayers have actually done something. They've made a difference. But I want to go back into the original Aramaic translation, and Greek and Aramaic both, but this is going to be from the original Aramaic. In the Gospel of Thomas, you see Greek and Aramaic, is why I'm clarifying this. And I want to read you, and it's very close, but there's a powerful and subtle difference that was left out in the translation, and it may very well be because the translators did not understand what you and I are exploring right now. And because they didn't understand it, they simply streamlined the languaging. So, in the translated version, and if you'd like to see this for yourself, it comes from Neil Douglas Clotes, is the name of the translator. There's a little book called Prayers of the Cosmos. It is a beautiful, beautiful book where he retranslates so many of the very powerful prayers, and this is one of them. Now listen to the difference. In the original text, it begins a very similar way. Quote, all things that you ask straightly, directly, from inside my name, you'll be given. Okay, now here comes the translation that was in error. This is the original. Ask without hidden motive and be surrounded by your answer. Be enveloped by what you desire, that your gladness be full. That is a single, very powerful statement. I'm going to break this down. Ask without hidden motive. That is inviting you to ask without attachment to the outcome. It's actually a very Buddhist concept. Ask without attachment to the rightness, the wrongness, the goodness, the badness, or the joy or the disappointment as to whether or not your prayer is answered, without attachment to the outcome. Okay? Be surrounded by your answer. Be enveloped by what you desire. The only way to be is if those things are already present. Your prayer is already answered. You're coming from the place that the prayer has already been answered. So the key to what we're saying here, feel the feeling. Feel as if the prayer is already answered with as many senses as you can. Smell, touch, taste, hearing. Feel as if your body is already healed. Feel as if your perfect relationship is already present. Feel as if your abundance is already present. Invoke all of those senses. The bottom line of everything I'm saying to you is through the fifth mode of prayer, our feeling-based prayer, we are given the ability to communicate directly with the possibilities that exist in the universal field, in this divine matrix, and to do so in a language that the matrix recognizes. Our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions have preserved the knowledge and the technique to interact with the divine matrix and for us to rewrite our personal as well as the global reality code. Well, in the next episode, we'll discover why our relationship with this matrix literally holds the key to the crises that are destroying our families and our communities, polarizing our societies and our nations today. So I want to thank you for joining me for this very special presentation, and be sure to tune in for our next all-new episode of The Divine Matrix, Bridging Time, Space, Miracles, and Belief.